Over the last couple of years, I've been working on a couple different projects, and one of the projects ended up being looking into disability statistics. Well, in my time lately, I've been thinking about it a lot, and even found another document through Stats Canada on disability statistics with women in particular. And going through it, I was quite amazed at the actual studied statistical barriers. I mean, granted, some of these statistics are like 7, 8 years old, 2011, 2012. We're now 2019. So I do have to take some of it with a grain of salt and hope that there's been actually improvement since then. So when the next statistics come out, it'll be really, really interesting to see how it has changed, because I really, really hope it has, because enough programs are in place now that it should have. So the second phase of my doctoral research was related to people with disabilities and skills. Phase one was language for specific purposes, which I'll get into a whole other time. When I went into phase two of my PhD work, I started reading statistics that I could hardly believe about people with disabilities, especially women. Here, I present some of them from my own point of view. So these are the ones that really stood out to me. According to Statistics Canada, in 2012, there were more women than men reporting disability. Women with disabilities are more likely to be alone, and they're more likely to be single parents than their male counterparts, and pain-related disabilities are the highest for both genders. I learned that I am a member of a group of women, or have been a member of the group of women with disabilities who have been single parents, 11%, and to have lived alone. 24.6% of women with disabilities live alone. And by the way, according to one of my classmates from my doctoral seminar course, single parents in vulnerable sectors are most likely to wind up in abusive relationships. Talk about scarier. Talk about scary. I mean, even scarier, I have been in all of those positions, so I do understand way more than I understand very, very well, so much so that I could help other people through it. There were fears that I had that had been confirmed in here. Like, I worried that as a woman with disabilities, and it would be hard for a partner to handle. You know what? It's true. Men with disabilities are more likely to be married, while women tend to be alone. 14.5% of women versus 8.9% of men. And only 5.8% of the women with disabilities have their child living with them, versus 16.1% of women without disabilities have children living with them. Imagine, only as a woman with disabilities to have a child living with them, only 5.8%. Now, I don't know if that's because the father has custody of the child, or if that woman just decided they don't want to bring a child into their life given their disabilities. It's really hard to say. That'd be a number to look into on a research level. Of course, there's also the common sense aspect. As the severity of disability increases, as does the cost. For myself, that includes hearing aids, a prosthetic eye every, 8 to 10 years. And I am one of 86% of women who do use prescriptions. Myself, I use medical marijuana, so there'll never be coverage, or there hasn't not been any sort of coverage for that up until now. I pay the same as even recreational users do. So you have to look at other options. Figuring it out. But that's what helps me, and that's what makes me high functioning and getting through the day. And policies on campuses and workplaces on marijuana use, especially when it go into the recreational use, really need to consider their medical marijuana users. So that's going to be out of pocket no matter what for me. Education is where I found some hope through government programs, and being told wild tales of how things would be covered by different things than they were. And I took advantage of as many grants as I possibly could, and I even graduated with Dean's List from my bachelor's degree. I was working crazy amount of hours and doing my degree, and it was great. I achieved a lot. Women with disabilities were half as likely to have obtained a bachelor's degree than those without. This is where I have been more fortunate. I have been accepted to a couple of programs, and with financial assistance, I will always find a way mentality. And I had opportunities to attend workshops, and I took those opportunities and I attended those workshops to be able to develop the skills I need to properly fulfill my educational requirements and become a productive member of society and be able to hold a job and be able to work and do all of those things that normal people do that we're all expected to do. Okay. So, thanks to the opportunity to attend as many of the workshops as possible, I am part of a cohort of women with disabilities who did enjoy their educational experience. I enjoyed it too. I actually did. And I love seeing in the statistics that they had a very enjoyable experience. Unfortunately, I can tell you from personal experience that the academic faculty side doesn't match the student side, though. And that is something in higher education that I feel is unfortunate because all the systems are there and could easily be ported to being used for their faculty as well as their students to be able to continue that growth, to be able to continue that development, because that's how I was able to get as far as I am today. That's it. When it comes to education, over half of those with disabilities required more time to complete their studies. Whoa, my hair went all wild. Okay. Over half of those with disabilities required more time to complete their studies. I was fortunate. Again, with the workshops I attended, I was able to keep up with my cohorts. In fact, my note-taking skills got so darn good that I started volunteering to do the note-taking for anybody else struggling in my class, and would even provide them for free to other classmates and people who, struggle with note-taking because it is a particular skill. I was very fortunate to have that. Uh, Rural sociology, bro's prolific note taker. It was fun. I also needed to work. I was fortunate that I was able to adapt methods to keep up with my cohort and then some. I also needed to work to pay bills. I always preferred to go to work than to take on further debt. That was my decision. In my PhD years, it will be likely that I'll have to go part-time and it will take me longer due to many unfortunate circumstances that I'm in the process of overcoming. I will get through this. And I do feel like the 36% who felt like people avoided me or that I got left out of things, I also have learned to love being in that 36%. It's something I have embraced personally, and that alone time and that quietness and all of that is part of what makes me a good librarian, and to be able to be good at what I do. It's one of those things I flipped around to be turned into something to my advantage. Thankfully, bullying in academia is fairly well dealt with in most Canadian universities, to my knowledge. The secondary school system, not even going to touch that one. So I was not a part of the roughly 25% of people with disabilities who experienced bullying. And this is where life as a person with disabilities who, if they manage to achieve a certain level of education, work becomes a missing piece of the puzzle and going into the labor force. Statistics Canada stated in their report that the severity of disability increases decreases the type of work you can do sometimes. And there's not always adaptations for that, or it's badly managed, those adaptations. So it requires them to limit the number of hours to work, or they may require workplace accommodations. But in general, about 62% of people with disabilities ages 25 to 54 participate in the workforce. 62%. The rest I mean, really, even of that 62%, and the reason it's 25 to 54 is because most programs like the RDSP, QPP, and a lot of those will expect people with disabilities to stop working at about 55, 57 years old. And that's if you look at most of the government program criteria. And of course, women in general already experience a higher unemployment rate. This is significant, though. It's 13.4% to 9.5%. On the flip side, women and women with disabilities are more likely to work part-time. So when you are working, you are involved in more institutions than just the government. You're also involved in an employment institution, which can often feel isolating depending on their programs. And indeed, nearly half of those with disabilities perceived labor force discrimination, and that they felt disadvantaged due to their condition, or felt that they were perceived as and considered to be disadvantaged because of their disability by the employer. It's hard to not feel isolated with that, and that's where having check-ins with managers or having specialists, because managers, like professors, don't know necessarily how to deal with people with disabilities. In academia, they have a lot of programs that are geared towards professors for people with disabilities. Expand that to managers, expand that to department heads, expand that to others who have to guide people to go through, because once you graduate as a person with disabilities, you go into the workforce and you're left. And you hope there are programs. You hope the insurance covers everything. You hope you can access what you once had, and you discover, nope. You find other means. There's always a way. It's a wonderful thing about life. There's always a way. Surprisingly, given all the barriers mentioned above, nearly 28% of women with disabilities reported salaries and wages and salaries at only a few points less than men, which is wonderful. Women were less likely to be self-employed, which I find is rather surprising, at 7.7% for women versus 12.5% of men with disabilities. The rest reported assistance of all sorts in 2012. Unsurprisingly, however, is that women with disabilities have a lower average income compared to all three of their other cohorts. So that's women in general, men with disabilities, and men in general. In Atlanta, Canada, where I live, women with disabilities reported an average of $30,000 to $30,290 a year for personal income. Now imagine I achieved a position where I could make up to $84,000, where I was making $84,000 a year at my departure. In Canada, the average increases as a household, but dives deeply if the woman with disabilities lives alone. Even though I face disabilities due to my impairments and chronic pain, my objective is to always be a functional member of society.